people's fight against injustice in the United States. From the abolition of slavery, to securing the right to vote, to ending Jim Crow laws, and on into today.
When I think about the story of Jesus and connecting it to enslavement, to the history of African Americans, it's always being on the side of those who are most marginalized and trying to transform society to respond to those people.
So you look at the Bible and you read the first century church and how the church was formed. It was formed in Jewish communities, and Jews in the first century were an oppressed ethnic and religious minority. So the church, though, that came to the United States came from Europe, and it was a church built on colonialism, and white supremacy was interwoven. And so what we received was a European form of Christianity that was very different than what you read about in the pages of the Bible.
Even as our theological frameworks have expanded to reflect the experiences and theologies of Christians around the world, the bedrock of white supremacy still shows through our language.
When we talk about Western theology, we don't say this is actually Swiss theology or German theology or specifically American theology. We just say it's theology. We centralize Western theology by just calling it theology, and all the others are on the periphery: black theology, womanist theology, liberation theology. And we've created an otherness because we're saying you're not the norm.
My entire experience in seminary, we're going to assimilate you, we're going to teach you good theology, we're going to teach you the way that we do it, then we're going to send you out there, right?
It's the way we think about how we're going to bring our good American or Western progressive theology to a world that doesn't know any better. To say we're going to go to Africa and fix their theology for them. We're going to go to Asia and fix their theology for them. I think that assumption of the superiority of one culture or one people group over against the other is much more common than we realize.
If you're not willing to submit to the leadership of a local leader, an indigenous leader, a leader of color, then you're not actually coming in to do ministry. You're actually going to be manifesting colonization.
Just the way that I saw missions being worked in our communities of color here in Chicago as well, seeing how white churches that had money would come in, the thought that there wasn't Jesus here until they came, that they were bringing Jesus into our city. And I'm like, Jesus is already in this city. Jesus is already working through plenty of us that are doing this work.
The Eurocentric roots of the American church have created structures that focus on the experiences and perspectives of white people, a focus that creates all kinds of unseen biases.
I'll be honest, I know I have plenty of bias. I have plenty of things that I assume about other people. And so I think it's not a question of not having assumptions. I think it's a question of what do you do with them? And are you aware of them?
I think the most important thing that we can do is to get out of the way, in the sense that there are people in the United States and people around the world, in immigrant communities, in global Christianity, who are reading the Bible very differently than we are.
And by having folks speaking for their own communities, speaking of how they interpret the scripture, we now have a counter-narrative that can be put in conversation with our traditional narrative.
The diversity of voices around the world serve to remind us that the Word of God carries a core message of inclusion, and that God cannot be limited to one cultural expression. There is a popular story of race in the United States that goes something like this.
The United States of America is the land of opportunity, a melting pot where people from all over the world come to live in freedom, to escape repression, to share in the American dream.
This is a familiar story, one we've all heard many times. It is the story of American exceptionalism. This story is about a noble war to end slavery in the United States and extending the right to vote to formerly enslaved peoples, of banding together to win a world war twice. a story of civil rights earned, equality before the law, and equality at the ballot box. This is a story of progress. In this story, there is no organized effort to harm black people by white people.
The truth is, there's no organized effort to harm black people by white people. That doesn't exist here.
See? There is, however, a counter-narrative of our nation's history.
There are these huge gaping holes in what we call U.S. history because it's not told from the perspective of people of color, because it's not written or institutionally affirmed by people of color.
Filling in the gaping holes of U.S. history paints a very different picture of what it means to celebrate the United States. This story includes the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade and the growth of slavery across the English colonies. This story recognizes the resistance to evil among those who were enslaved and the commitment to slavery among white people. This story is characterized by the violence against black and brown bodies and born out of white supremacist theology, racist laws, and cultural oppression. One that celebrates black achievement in the face of such oppression and confronts violence always. White Americans have never needed to tell this other story. The narrative of white supremacy makes it possible to see only the story of progress.
I think white folks don't need to imagine it, or thought they didn't. If you're not thinking about black folks 24/7, and by black I mean people of color. You can spare yourself. You can read books, you can watch TV shows, but at the end of the day, you can go back to being white and be spared.
When I served in rural Ohio, we were the only black family in the town that we lived in. And it was about as challenging as you can imagine. I just had another baby. That was our youngest. So I'm at home and getting ready to nurse. And Benny wants to go for a walk. My husband goes for a walk, takes the two other kids in the double stroller. And as he's going for a walk, he comes right back. I mean, just a matter of 2 minutes, he's right back home. And I said, what happened? And he said, this parishioner, he said, he just tried to kill us. I said, what are you talking about? You know, I'm thinking he's exaggerating. He said he tried to run us over. He drove up onto the curve and he said, it was right after President Obama was reelected. He said, that fucking nigger president is trying to ruin my country and I'm going to run you fucking niggers out of this town. And proceeded to drive up onto the curve to kill my husband and our two small children.
The American mistake is believing that we are exceptional and different. This is a country that's built on the genocide of indigenous people, that an entire economy is built on the black backs of people who've never been given reparations, and has continued to reinforce those racist structures and systems for its own benefit. And that fault line runs through the entire American experience. This has always been who America is.
It's easy to think that the story of violence against black bodies belongs to the country's past. But white supremacy is still on the march, enabled by the lack of understanding of how society reinforces racial prejudice across legal, educational, professional, and social metrics. Racist systems are failing black Americans. One example is home ownership, the centerpiece of the American dream.
What we understand and what historically we can see with African Americans is that the way that you become a citizen is through ownership. Because what happens when you own a home? You have say not only of your own domicile, but then you get to be a part of a community, right, that can take political action.
The benefits of home ownership in the U.S. are enormous, from tax breaks and credit benefits to building equity and passing it to our descendants. These benefits have been systematically denied to a majority of black Americans. In the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, loan programs were created to help Americans purchase homes. In order to determine who received a loan, the government created color-coded maps where green neighborhoods indicated low risk and red neighborhoods were high risk. This practice, now known as redlining, heavily favored white communities.
Home ownership for African Americans has been racially contested because of the ways in which the federal government colluded with mortgage companies to redline and to blockbust African American neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that were predominantly African American were automatically deemed high risk, which meant they were less likely to get loans to purchase, right?
Right after World War II, we had this huge endowment or investment in the suburbs that came from the Federal Housing Authority. Of the $120 billion that was invested in suburban housing, less than 2% of that went to non-white families.
This is Levittown, Pennsylvania, a new suburban community of 60,000 people, midway between Philadelphia and Trenton, New Jersey. With its giant shopping center, winding lanes named for flowers and trees, it is fairly typical of communities all over America, where families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life. Why did you select Levittown to live?
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
In the 19th century, the U.S. government claimed that people of African descent were property. In the 20th century, the same government worked to ensure Black Americans couldn't own property. Predatory and biased lending practices have been exposed over and over in the United States, revealing a continuing systemic effort to withhold economic benefits from Black families that are readily available to white families. So what is a white homeowner to do? Give up their home?
We're not asking you to sell your home. We're not asking you to even move, but we're asking you to think about the structures that we all implicitly buy into that create and replicate inequality, and how we can think about dismantling those.
The answer to the problem is eventually when you find that there are no more areas to which a white person can move without having a Negro family in. Well, that would be the best end that there could be to segregation, and it is probably something that will happen in the future, perhaps in the near future.
When Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of a new world in 1492, he brought with him a belief in his God-given right to take over any lands he found in the name of Spain and Christianity. This right was given to Columbus and all European explorers by various papal edicts that would come to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery. It's hard to overstate the impact the Doctrine of Discovery has had on the world in the last 500 years.
So the Doctrine of Discovery is basically an agreement between the European nations in the 15th century. Whoever discovers it first and lays claim to the land, they own that. If Portugal goes out and discovers some land in Western Africa, and 15 years later France goes out and discovers the same land, who does this land belong to?
With the Doctrine of Discovery, such questions are easily dispensed of.
It essentially starts out as this peace agreement between European nations, but really what it becomes is the theological authority to enslave non-Christian people and also just to strip their land of all the resources. Any movable or immovable good now belongs to the crown.
The earliest edict of this kind was the Doom de Versailles, issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452. Which gave colonizing Europeans permission directly from God to, quote, capture, vanquish, and subdue the enemies of Christ.